of my own consciousness. And I think I must have been about 10 or 11 or 12, I can't remember exactly. Now, I wasn't raised in a religious home, more of a kind of agnostic home, and so, you know, I wasn't sort of thinking about those bigger questions necessarily, but it just came into my head. What is a human being? What exactly are we? That's really what I'm getting at with this question, am I just my brain? And what a human being is a question that has occupied people at every stage of history. Are we just advanced primates? Are we machines? Are we souls confined to a body longing to escape? Or is there another answer that we could give? And the question, what is a human being, asks a question of identity. And lots of answers are offered today on the question of human identity. The fashion and cosmetics industry would say you are your body. The financial world might say you are your income. The political world would say you are your influence. And the academy that we all know so well in this city would say you are what you publish and what you write. Well, neuroscientists have also weighed in on this conversation surrounding human identity, and they say your brain defines you. You are your brain. The choices you make, for good or ill, the personality that you happen to have, even the religious beliefs you may or may not have, are all dictated by the activity in your brain. Now, I'm sure I don't need to convince an audience such as this how incredible the human brain is. This organ sitting between your ears is more developed in humans than in any other creature, contains somewhere between 80 and 100 billion cells, which at any moment are sending impulses, thousands of impulses at speeds of over 250 miles an hour. At any one moment, you're generating enough electricity to power an LED light. Probably gives another angle on the thought of a light bulb moment. And I have over 10 years of experience of working in functional MRI. I did a PhD at the University of Cambridge, then went to the Medical College of Wisconsin in the States and worked with cocaine addicts, looked at what's happening in the human brain during cocaine addiction. And then I actually returned to the brain imaging lab here in Oxford, up at the JR Hospital, for a number of years before moving into this area known as apologetics, where we're giving reasons and answers. And so I have insight into what brain imaging data can and cannot tell us about human identity. And here's the question: does it necessarily follow that just because the human brain is incredible and unique, that everything it means to be a human being is dictated by your brain? Now, some very smart people believe this. A lot of them are in this city. But one such person is Francis Crick, that the molecular biologists among you will recognise as the person that co-discovered the DNA double helix, along with James Watson. And he began to make philosophical statements later on in his career. In his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, he wrote this about human identity. He said, you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. And this hypothesis is so alien to the ideas of most people alive today that it can truly be said to be astonishing. Well, 50 years later, this hypothesis is far from alien, and some no longer consider it a hypothesis. Some consider it to be fact, that you are your brain. And this is also filtered into popular culture. The historian Yuval Harari is the author of 2 best-selling books, Sapiens, which talks about the history of humankind, Homo Deus, which talks about the future of humanity. Together these have sold millions of copies worldwide. And in Homo Deus, Harari makes this assertion. He says, over the last few decades, biologists have reached the firm conclusion that the man or woman pressing the buttons and drinking the tea from a vending machine, that's the context of the quote, is an algorithm. Humans are algorithms. We are computational machines. What do you think about that? You might be asking, so what? What does it matter if we are? Well, there are some very significant implications. If we are just driven by our brains, then are we genuinely free, or do we just do what our brains tell us? Secondly, is religious belief and religious experience anything genuine at all, or is it just generated by your brain and it begins and ends there? Thirdly, there are ethical implications of this view. Is personhood dictated by somebody that has a healthy, fully functioning brain? And if so, what do we do with those in whom their brains are not yet fully developed, such as the unborn or premature babies, or those with brain damage, or those with degenerative diseases such as dementia and Alzheimer's? There are significant implications for ethical decision-making. And finally, there are implications for AI. If we are simply machines, then will there one day be conscious androids walking the streets of Oxford? Will we be replicable in every sense? If we are simply a machine, then we are replaceable in theory. And so the answer that you give to the question, am I just my brain, has implications that, although they are of great interest to the neuroscientist and of great interest to the philosopher, they actually have very far-reaching implications for all of us. And many would agree that it is not enough to simply talk about the brain. We have to also talk about the mind. You see, there are two different things at play here. There is the brain with all of its cells and neurons and electrical activity and hormones and synapses and chemicals. And then there's the mind with all of its thoughts and feelings and memories and emotions. And the key question we need to ask is, what is the relationship between these two things? Now, this is the million-dollar question. And this is not a new question that science has suddenly thrown up and we have to find an answer. This has been debated for centuries. The language previously would have been of soul and body, and today it's mind and brain. But this is not a new question. This is an ancient question. And it is known as the mind-brain problem. How do you get from neurons to, I've had a really hard day today? How do you get from brain activity to what it is like to be you? And the view that you are your brain is essentially saying there isn't such a thing as the mind. Mental processes are brain processes. Mental states are brain states. Which is kind of like saying there isn't anything that it is like to be you. There is only your brain. But isn't that a bit of an absurd way of thinking about human beings? Doesn't that diminish us and just look at us through one particular lens? You know, I think it's actually an incoherent view, because the person expressing it is basically saying, my first-person perspective is that there is no first-person perspective. My individual view is that there is no individual view on the world. It doesn't hang together. It is incoherent. We don't seem to live as though this is the case either. We read and we write autobiographies precisely because human beings have a unique angle on the world that they want to share. We're told that mindfulness, tells us to focus in on this inner self for a better state of well-being. We don't seem to live as though this is the case, and all of our anger at human trafficking, humanitarian crises and climate change is precisely because the people that are involved and caught up and will be affected by those are human beings with a unique experience of suffering. And so we don't seem to live as though this is the case. It might sit fine in the lecture theatre, it doesn't sit well in the real world. And we need to lift our ideas out of lecture theatre into the world in order to properly assess them. And Hilary says that scientists have reached a firm conclusion about this, but that is simply not the case. What the science is showing is that mind and brain are connected. If you put someone in an MRI scanner and ask them to use their mind in some way, maybe it's a memory task, what you find is the brain lights up, particular networks in the brain. And so we know that mind and brain are connected, that the human is integrated, but that's not the same as saying they're identical. And so we need to really distinguish what science can tell us and when we start making statements that go beyond what the science is saying. And just because mind and brain are connected does not mean they are identical. In fact, you can make a case that they could not be more different. Let me try and show you why. Imagine I were to ask you to describe to me the smell of coffee. Hands up if you had a coffee today. I'm actually due another one. I need another one after this talk. I need you to describe to me the smell of coffee in physical terms. If all there is are physical states, then describe this to me physically. Now, showing me the chemical structure of caffeine doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. Telling me all about the physiology going on in your body when you swallow it doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. To encounter the smell of coffee, you have to smell it. It can't be broken down. You can't get any closer with physical descriptions. And philosophers talk about qualia. And these are qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. And this is why scientists and philosophers, who may or may not believe in God, say, look, mind and brain are two very, very different things. Brain processes alone are not enough to explain qualia, the experience of the world that we all have. Another way to illustrate this is to say, look, imagine I were to monitor, to try and conduct an experiment to find out what it is like for you to revise for your finals. And we put an EEG cap on you and we monitor signal from your brain transmitted to your skull 24/7. And we stick you in an MRI scanner once a week, and we take some structural scans and some functional scans. And we've got quite a lot of interesting brain data. Will that tell us what it is like for you to revise for your finals? Of course not. Oh, lots of interesting data. Not going to throw that away. But it won't tell us what it is like for you to cope with expectations of parents, anxiety, depression, pressure, stress, relief. You see, this view seeks to diminish a human being and look at them just through one lens and say, that is who you are. But actually, without even stepping beyond the scientific realm, we can say there is much more to a human being than simply their brain. And so much so that, I guess, agnostic David Chalmers, Professor of Neuroscience in Australia, has distinguished between easy and hard problems of consciousness. Easy problems are to do with bits of your brain that switch on and off when you move from one state of consciousness to another, such as maybe from wakefulness to sleep, or when you go from being awake to being anaesthetised, if you've ever had surgery. But hard problems are accounting for conscious experience. And this is a hard problem. Now, easy problems are not easy, by the way, and whole lifetimes of research are taken up in their quest. But compared to the hard problem, they're trivial. And this is what philosophers have really landed on. Decades of throwing the brightest minds at this have not got any further forward. Or as Baroness Susan Greenfield, Professor of Physiology here at Oxford, would say, and listen to the language that she uses, how does the water of boring old brain cells and sludgy stuff translate into the wine of phenomenological subjective experience? How do you get from water to wine? It's a good question. And on the basis of a lifetime of research, some have drawn some very interesting conclusions. I could give you a number of examples here. I'll just give you one. Professor Michael Egnor is a professor of neurosurgery at Stony Brook University School of Medicine in New York, and he has spent 30 years conducting neurosurgery, he says that many of his patients are missing massive chunks of their brain, and yet their mind is intact. It's still them that he's speaking to. He talks about removing parts of the frontal lobe of one patient while they're awake somehow. I don't know how this happens, but being able to conduct a conversation with them while he's doing that. And after 30 years of working in this field, Professor Egnor has concluded that the mind of a person is simply beyond the workings of their brain. Of course it's connected, but there are some senses in which it is beyond the brain. And he says this: materialism, the view that matter is all that exists, is the premise of much contemporary thinking about what a human being is, and yet evidence from the laboratory, the operating room, and clinical experience points to a less fashionable conclusion. Human beings straddle the material and immaterial realms. Now, of course, there are other ways of describing the mind-brain relationship that I don't have time to go into, but you might want to ask about that in the questions. I also talk about it more in a book that I've written on this topic, Am I Just My Brain? Now, even if we were to solve all of the interactions going on in the mind and brain, and even if we were to kind of fully describe that relationship, there would still be questions that are unanswered. Why does the mind exist in the first place? Why do we have a mind? The question that I asked as a 10-year-old child. And does a purely physicalist approach to the world, materialism, does this offer the best explanation for the human mind? Well, many scientists and philosophers argue not. If we're seeing that the forces of nature alone are not enough to explain the mind, then maybe we need to look for explanations for the mind that go beyond the forces of nature. And it all really comes down to this: is what you can see with your eyes all that there is in this world? Or is there more? Is there more to this life? And if we entertain the possibility that God exists, does this help us make sense of the human mind? It does. Because if God exists, then mind has actually always existed. Before there was anything physical, there was God. The first words of the Bible say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But in the beginning was mind. And this mind has given rise to everything physical, and has also somehow made humanity with some of his imprint. Theologians talk about humans being made in the image or the imprint of God. And so theists say that we have a mind because God has a mind. We think because God thinks. We are conscious because he is conscious and has made us so that we can ask these bigger questions. And arguably we are conscious so that we can enjoy a friendship with God, who is conscious and relational and very much alive and well in this world. And I could say a little more, that this God has actually made human beings not simply as an extrapolation of the animal kingdom, though that doesn't mean we discount anthropology, but if we look at the big picture, we're also made actually a little lower than heavenly beings, and we're crowned with glory and honour. If you simply look at the scientific narrative, we are a blip on the landscape. There is no case for reading meaning into our existence. We are a tiny, tiny, tiny speck. The Christian faith says there's a very different narrative when you look at that same landscape. You're created with glory and honour. You're crowned with glory and honour. You're created for a life of meaning and purpose by God and for him. And that's what I came to discover. Having grown up in a very loving but kind of religiously neutral home, I went to Bristol to study biochemistry, and I arrived there, you know, assuming that science and God were incompatible. You couldn't be a Christian and be a scientist at the same time. And I asked that question at a Guerrilla Christian in Freshers Week, and I was told, yes, you can. And that was a bit of a game changer for me. I'd literally never been told anything like that, and I so grilled a lot more Christians, asked a lot more questions, and got to the point where actually I became convinced that although I didn't have all of the answers, I became persuaded that Jesus was real and credible, and there was also something in me that I needed. My best efforts at being the best version of myself weren't working. I needed help from outside of myself. I was told that Jesus died for me, that he forgave me for the things I'd done wrong, so that I can live in his forgiveness, free from regret and shame and guilt, and be looking forwards. And I decided to follow Jesus Christ at the age of 20. And I've not looked back from that. That was a couple of decades ago. And it was amazing to return to science and actually be uncovering these mechanisms in the natural world, whilst also knowing the God behind it. And so, you know, being a Christian doesn't make you a worse scientist, by the way. It should make you a better one. And not that you can also be a brilliant scientist if you're not Christian. And we see that, of course. I just watched A Theory of Everything with my daughter last night about the life of Stephen Hawking. And so that's my story. And so that this narrative that you are just your brain, I think it reduces humans to a lesser version of ourselves.